Now, I'm an academic, I'm a researcher, so I'm going to be very boring. I'm not going to sing, and some of you may have had the misfortune of hearing me sing, so you'll be very glad I'm not going to sing. I'm not going to dance. I'm going to tell a story. And it's a story which I'm going to tell by using numbers and data and research. But it's a story about the way in which poverty, discrimination and disadvantage damages the health and well-being of people with disabilities. In this context, I'm going to be talking primarily about people with intellectual disabilities. Before I start, the very last slide that I show will have my email address on it. And anybody who would like a copy of this presentation, if you email me, I'd be very happy to share it with you. What I want to do is to briefly address 4 questions. I want to say something, again this will be brief, about what we know about the impact of exposure to environmental adversity on well-being and health in general. I then want to say a little bit about what we know about the extent to which people with intellectual disabilities are exposed to environmental adversities. And want to summarise then what we have learned over the past decade or so about the impact that exposure to environmental adversity has on the health and well-being of people with intellectual or developmental disabilities. And then I want to finish off by drawing out some of the implications of this knowledge for research, which I'll keep very brief, but spend more time focusing on what does this actually mean for policy and practice. Jean Jude's in her opening address made reference to the recent launch of the World Report on Disability. And in a sense, that's a report throughout which runs a strong theme that understanding disability is about understanding discrimination and disadvantage. And if we are going to address the human rights and the well-being and the social inclusion of people with disabilities, then we need to think very carefully about how we are going to do that by addressing the disadvantage and the discrimination to which people are exposed. First, a few clarifications. What do I mean by environmental adversities? Well, actually, I mean an awful lot of things by environmental adversities. I mean that very wide range of either material hazards or psychosocial hazards to which people are likely to be exposed, or people that are at risk of exposing. And this runs from things from poor nutrition, poor sanitation, poor housing, injury and trauma, through to social exclusion, not having much control over your life, having a low social status. Now, the extent to which any of us are likely to be exposed to these types of adversities is obviously going to vary. It varies across time, it varies across cultures, it varies as a function of the development or the wealth of countries. So if you're born today in Niger, then the key hazards for you are likely to be the material hazards located on the left of this slide. If you're born today in Israel or the United Kingdom, it's likely that the key hazards for you are going to be psychosocial hazards rather than material hazards. Although we shouldn't forget that in both of our countries, there are still people who do without food because they cannot afford it. But within any society that we look at, our risk of exposure is not random. And in fact, risk of exposure to many of these things is clearly patterned in relation to your position in society, your socio-economic position. Because all societies are hierarchical. In all societies, there are people who have greater wealth, greater power, greater prestige than others. And this ranking, the hierarchical structuring of society is not a result of some natural law. It's a result of our social institutions. The way our educational system regulates access to the knowledge which enables people to succeed. The way in which people's access to the labour market is regulated. The way in which people's access to judicial systems is regulated. By the wealth of their parents, the family that they're born into, by their gender, their ethnicity, race, religion, and by their disability. So what do we know about the impact of exposure to this broad range of environmental adversities? No, I thought you were going to turn me off. What do we know about the impact of exposure to this broad range of environmental adversities on people's health and well-being? Well, the first part of the title of this conference is Learning from the Past. And it's not news, in a sense, that exposure to these types of adversities is damaging to our health and well-being. Accounts of the impact of poverty, of disadvantage, run back through into antiquity. And they run back to the birth of epidemiology as a quantitative science. So just two brief examples from history. The first is from the work of Louis-René Villemey, published in 1826, nearly 200 years ago. And what Villemey did was try and answer a question which was important in Europe in the early 19th century. Who lives longer, or who dies sooner? Is it the dissolute wealthy people who die sooner, or is it poorer people who die sooner? And what he did, he actually measured wealth in the 12 arrondissements of Paris, ranked them from the richest neighbourhoods to the poorest neighbourhoods, and then figured out, using information from the French census around the time, who lived longer. And what you see as you move from the wealthier neighbourhoods on the left to the richer neighbourhoods on the right, the richer the area in which you're living, the longer you are going to live, with mortality rates around about 1/3 higher in the richer neighbourhoods. Okay? This is 200 years old data. Another example from Friedrich Engels. Engels is probably best known to us all as the co-author of the Communist Manifesto with Karl Marx. But Engels did some wonderful work in Manchester in England, and that's my hometown, in which he was documenting the conditions of the working class in England in the early mid-19th century, as the Industrial Revolution was taking hold there. And what's interesting when you read Engels' accounts of what was happening in Manchester at the time was the way his descriptions of what was happening in the mid-19th century resonate strongly today. The way in which as he put it, the sufferings of children are indelibly stamped on the health and well-being as they become adults. The premature aging of people exposed to appalling living and working conditions in our early industrialization, an issue which he termed social murder. And he also quantified in a particular area of Manchester in which I used to live, strangely enough, the extent to which the wealth of the street in which you live and the wealth of the house on the street in which you live is going to be determined to how long you live. So let's learn from the past. Now, while it's not news that exposure to adversity and disadvantage has a detrimental effect on our health and well-being, we have learned some things over the past couple of centuries. And some of the things that I guess we have learned more recently, and we'll hear more about this afternoon, I'm sure, is the effects of timing. There are no critical periods at which exposure to adversity is fundamentally different, but there are more sensitive periods. And early exposure to adversity, earlier in life, certainly can have long-term effects. And one of the things that we need to think about in terms of disability policy and practice is how we can give disabled children the best start in life. Because we know that early experience is important, probably more important than experience at other times. Not critical, but sensitive period. A corollary of that is that we've also learned that what's important is not exposure to adversity at any one point in time or one particular adversity, but the impact of cumulative exposure to the breadth and depth of adversity over the life course. Third, we've learned much more about the nature of the adversities which are damaging. Of course, major trauma is damaging. I'm sure we're all familiar with post-traumatic stress disorder, etc. But what's becoming more and more apparent is the importance of the everyday, the mundane adversities of life. Just living a life in which you are of a lower status, of which you have less control than other people. The day-to-day reminder of your position. Those are fundamentally important in determining our future health and well-being, how long we'll live and how well we will be while we're alive. Fourth, I think we've learned much more about what we now call vulnerability or resilience. Exposure to adversity is in general damaging for people. But of course, some people appear better positioned to cope with exposure to adversity than others. Now, this isn't news either. In the 19th century, there was much discussion about the predisposing conditions which led some people to get yellow fever or cholera than other people. So this notion about vulnerability and resilience on exposure to adversities or pathogens is not new. But we're beginning to learn more and more about that, and I will end by saying a little bit about the issue of vulnerability and resilience in relation to people with intellectual disability. And we're beginning to learn a lot more about how exposure to adversity gets under the skin, becomes biologically embedded in our bodies. Okay. In a sense, what I'm arguing is that while we have known this for a long time, are increasingly learning more and more about the impact of exposure to adversity on health and well-being. And that's critically important to understanding health inequalities and the health of populations and the health in countries. It's particularly relevant to understanding the health, well-being and social inclusion of people with intellectual disabilities. And the reason for that is pretty straightforward. And again, this isn't news, because we have known for a long time that people with intellectual disabilities are much more likely to be exposed to a wide range of environmental adversities than other people. This is just like Villemay. It's the same idea. Except here, what this graph shows is the chance that a child will have a mild intellectual disability depending upon the wealth of the neighbourhood in which they live in England in 2009. So this is fast-forwarding Villemay's ideas by 2 centuries to England. And the key message here is that in England in 2009, if you're living in one of the poorest 10% of our communities, you are nearly 4 times more likely to have an intellectual disability than if you're living in our 10% richest communities. That's a pretty large effect. Now, of course, the corollary of that is that, well, people with intellectual disabilities, and particularly people with less severe intellectual disabilities, are much more likely to be exposed to the types of environmental adversities that go with being poor and living in poor neighbourhoods. Now, just to illustrate that with some work we've been recently doing in Australia, looking at the effect of exposure to adversity on the future health and well-being of children with developmental delay. And so this is about 5,000 children, Australian children, who've been followed up every 2 years as they grow up. And we looked at 8 different types of adversities. You can see them listed down there. We didn't choose these at random. We chose these adversities because they were clearly linked to future developmental health of children in Australia. The key issue that we looked at, and I'll come back to this, is, well, to what extent are children with developmental delay exposed to multiple adversities? Now, if you look at children who don't have developmental delay, around about half of them are exposed when they're at age 4 or 5 to either none of those adversities or just one of those adversities. A small number, well, just over 10%, just over 1 in 10 of those children who didn't have developmental delays were exposed to 4 or more of that list of adversities when they were 4 or 5 years old. If we look at the black bars, which are children with more severe developmental delay, 1 in 3 of those children were exposed to multiple adversities when they're age 4 or 5. So it's an early, important period in the development of children with intellectual disabilities, with developmental delay. Nearly 1 in 3 of them are being exposed to multiple forms of environmental adversity that we know are detrimental to their developmental health. And I'll come back to this in a little later because I'll show you how this pans out for those children when they reach ages of 6 and 7 and 8 and 9. But it's not just about being poor and living in poor neighbourhoods, because we know that in all countries of the world, people with intellectual disabilities are much more likely to be exposed to disability-related discrimination. And for children, that often takes the form of bullying. So one of the things that we're currently looking at is exposure to bullying among adolescents with mild intellectual disabilities in our mainstream schools in England. On every measure of bullying that we could look at, children with intellectual disabilities were significantly more likely to report being bullied over the last year than children who didn't have intellectual disabilities. And the areas in which we saw the biggest differences were what we might think of as the more severe forms of bullying. Actually experiencing physical violence against yourself, having your money stolen by other children, and being bullied on a weekly basis at least over the last year. Now we know that bullying of children in schools is a marker for poorer health and poorer well-being of children as they grow up. And here we have a group of children who are at much greater risk of bullying, much greater risk of being bullied frequently and experiencing maybe the more traumatic aspects of bullying. And this is nothing to do with socioeconomic position or poverty, because when we control for things, we see exactly the same pattern. This is almost certainly due to disability-related bullying and harassment that those children experience in mainstream schools. So, we know that people with intellectual developmental disabilities are at increased risk of exposure to a wide range of adversities, partly because they are more likely to be poor than other children and live in poor neighbourhoods than other children, and partly as a result of disability-related discrimination and harassment that they will experience as growing up. We know that adversity, that exposure to these adversities is damaging to children's health and well-being, not only as children but also later on in life. So it's not exactly rocket science to figure out, well, we would expect children and people with intellectual disabilities to have poorer health and poorer well-being, because as children, they're poor kids growing up in poor neighbourhoods. Nothing to do with disability, but just because of their life experiences. And the information that we have supports those ideas. One of the things that we're doing in the context of the Public Health Observatory that we run for the English government is to summarise what we know about the health of people with intellectual disabilities in England. And we're currently looking at the health of 7-year-old children in England, because we have a large amount of information which we can use to do that. And if we look at the risk for poor health of 7-year-old children with intellectual disabilities in England, it's what we all know, what we would expect. They are over 5 times more likely to be rated by their mother as only having fair or poor health. They're about 4 times more likely than their non-intellectually disabled peers to have significant behavioural difficulties or significant emotional difficulties. They're about 60% more likely than their peers to be obese at age 7. They're about twice as likely to their peers to have problems with seeing at age 7. But this isn't just about disability. Because if we make like-by-like comparisons, comparing the health of these children with intellectual disabilities with the health of children who are experiencing the same kinds of homes and neighbourhoods when they were 9 months old, these differences reduce significantly. So if we, in effect, control for the life experiences of these children 6 years previously, when they were just 9 months old, the risks for poorer health diminish markedly. So the risk that children with intellectual disabilities have significant behavioural difficulties decreases by 50% when we begin to make these like-by-like comparisons. And this is only like-by-like in terms of in terms of the child's home environment when they were 9 months old, 6 years previously. This suggests, certainly to me, that if we are going to understand and if we are going to do something about the physical, emotional and behavioural health and well-being of people with intellectual disabilities, it's not just about addressing impairments. It's about addressing the environment and the life experiences of those people, in particular at an early age in their life. Oops, skip that one. I was asked by Dana to include some information from Israel, so I will do. One of the ways in which exposure to adversity becomes to have an impact on people's future life is by the development of the sense of control that people have. Increased risk, increased exposure to adversity is associated with a feeling of lack of control, of an inability to influence things which are important to you. And this is information from a report we're currently doing for the World Health Organization, as part of their strategic review of addressing health inequalities across the European regional of the World Health Organization, which of course includes Israel. And this isn't people with intellectual disabilities. This is people of working age with disabilities using the same definition of disability as was used in the World Report on Disability. So if you're an adult with disability in the United Kingdom, you're about 7 times more likely to say there are really important aspects of my life over which I have no control than if you don't have a disability. If you're an adult with disability in Israel, it's just under 5 times more likely than your non-disabled peers to say there are really important things, aspects of my life over which I have no control. Don't live in Denmark if you have a disability is one of the messages from this graph. Okay. Now we know that exposure to these types of environmental hazards can have a detrimental impact. It's possible, of course, that people with intellectual disabilities may be generally more or less resilient or more or less vulnerable to the impact of adversity. And some people have certainly argued that to the extent that psychological processes might be really important in mediating between exposure to impact and well-being, then, well, maybe people with intellectual disabilities aren't as affected by these things. I've heard that position put to me. So we decided to test that out and see what do we know about the extent to which people with intellectual disabilities are more or less resilient, are more or less vulnerable to the impact of adversity. And the limited evidence that we have, and it is limited, does suggest that people with intellectual disabilities are certainly not more resilient. They may be more vulnerable. There may be no difference. But there's certainly no evidence to suggest that somehow people with intellectual disabilities are in some sense immune from the impact of exposure to these mundane, everyday environmental adversities. And that's where I want to come back to Australian children. Because what we did is we followed these children up. You've already seen that. These children were followed up every 2 years. And we wanted to what we were particularly interested in is identifying children who showed very high levels of conduct difficulties across childhood. Because we know from research in criminology and child and adolescent mental health that children who persistently show high levels of conduct difficulties across childhood have very poor outcomes as adults, much more likely to get engaged with substance abuse, antisocial behaviour, the criminal justice system, etc. And so that was our focus. You know, what predicts why some children not have difficulties at a particular point in their life, but persistently across childhood have significant behavioural difficulties or conduct difficulties. And if we look at children who don't have any developmental delay, we see, as we would expect, the greater the breadth of exposure to environmental adversity at age 4 or 5, the more likely they are to show persistent conduct difficulties. Okay. So children who at age 4 or 5 are only exposed to one or none of the adversities listed have a very low risk of showing persistent conduct difficulties, about 2%. If they're exposed to 4 or more of those adversities, just under 10% of them will show significant levels of conduct difficulties, persistent conduct difficulties over time. What's interesting is what happens when we look at children with intellectual disabilities. And that's the red line. Because when we look at children who are not exposed to adversity at age 4 or 5, there is no difference in the risk of showing persistent conduct difficulties between children with and without intellectual disabilities. No difference at all. As the breadth of exposure increases, then that gap between children with and without intellectual disability grows. And if we look at those children who are exposed to high levels of adversity at age 4 or 5, just under 1 in 4 of those children, if they have an intellectual disability, will go on to show persistent conduct difficulties at age 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, 9. And that's a very large gap that is opening up. And what it suggests is that children with intellectual disabilities are perhaps less resilient, are more vulnerable to the impact of environmental adversity than other children. But of course, there's a huge difference here between the group on the left, exposed to low adversities, and the group on the right, exposed to high adversities. There's a huge difference there. And this is just what's happening when the child is 4 or 5 years old in relation to their developmental health at age 6, 7, and 8, 9. So, implications. I'm going to skip over the implications for research, because I'm a little bit pressed for time, because in a sense I think the important thing for this conference is to focus on what this means for policy and practice. And it's not rocket science, is it? We know that exposure to adversity is damaging. We know that people with intellectual disabilities may be less resilient, more vulnerable to the impact of those exposure. So what do we do in terms of policy and practice? We do two things. First, we reduce risk of exposure to adversity. And what that means, of course, is a range of initiatives, often called upstream initiatives, in which we create a society with greater equality, in which fewer children with intellectual disabilities are likely to be exposed to the types of damaging upbringings that we know they are exposed to. So we begin to look at things like tax transfers to reduce poverty rates, generally, but also ensuring that these are targeted and effective in support for families supporting a child with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We need to look at things like legislation and social marketing to reduce the levels of discrimination and disadvantage and abuse experienced by people with intellectual disabilities. And those, of course, are not only noble aspirations, but they are, of course, our legal obligations as two countries who have ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Several articles of which speak very clearly to the importance of social protection, protection from harm, abuse, etc. There are also clear threads which run through the European Declaration on the Health of Children with Intellectual Disabilities, the so-called Bucharest Declaration, that was signed by Israel, among other countries, last November in Bucharest, and is currently being ratified within the WHO European framework. There are also messages which clearly run through the World Report on Disability, recommendation 7 of which is directly using social marketing to reduce the level of stigma and discrimination faced by people with disabilities. And there are also a key recommendation of the 2009 WHO report on closing the gap in reducing global health inequalities. The first recommendation of which, the first overarching recommendation of which in relation to reducing health inequalities globally and within countries, is improved daily living conditions. So this is not just noble sentiments, these are our legal obligations under the UN Convention and are consistent with international policy, not just in relation to disability, but also in relation to addressing the inequalities in health which we see in so many countries. And this, learning from the past, again, these are not new sentiments. I owe this slide to a friend and colleague, Dave Gordon, and some of you may have seen it before, because it was stolen with his permission from a presentation he gave in Israel 2 years ago on the costs of poverty. One might not be surprised that Engels in 1845 was talking about social murder within our newly industrialized society. But here's another great thinker from 1845, Charles Darwin. If the misery of our poor be caused not by the laws of nature, which they're not, but by our institutions, great is our sin. Now, I just want to finish very briefly by thinking about what we also need to be doing while we are trying to achieve these aspirations in terms of reducing exposure to risk and poverty. Because we're not going to be able to wave a magic wand as much as we would like and do away with poverty and inequality in relation to disability within the next decade or so. So I guess the question then becomes, while we are doing that, what are the things that we can be doing in order to improve or enhance the resilience or reduce the vulnerability of people with intellectual disabilities and the families who support people with intellectual disabilities in the face of adversity? And I think the issue here is that, to keep at the forefront of our minds, is that resilience is not just a characteristic of individuals. It's not something that a person carries around inside them. There are some individual characteristics that help us be more resilient. So having good problem-solving skills is a capacity, a capability, which helps us be more resilient in the face of adversity. But resilience is much more about the social world and the communities in which we live. So that raises questions for us in terms of what can and should we be doing to build resilience in children with intellectual or developmental disabilities. How can we help them to be stronger in the face of adversity? And there's much that we can build on there, not from research in intellectual disability, but from research in relation to child resilience and vulnerability in the face of adversity. What makes a difference? Well, what seems to make a difference for children as they're growing up in the face of adversity is having a good relationship with one parent. One's enough. Having a good relationship with one parent. Having a sense of belonging to the community in which you're living. Having a sense of belonging to your school. Having a sense of achievement in something in your life that you can feel good about. These are things that we know for children in general can be powerful and can really help them even in the face of adversity. But also, how can we help families be stronger in the face of adversity? How can we shape and develop stronger communities? Because resilience occurs at all levels. How can we help individuals, but how can we help that individual in a social context? How can we help families? How can we help our communities? And how can we help our societies? Provide a more resilient environment, a less vulnerable environment, given that we know that children with intellectual disabilities and disabled people more generally are likely to be exposed to these adversities. There's some further reading for those of you who want it, and that's my email address. As I said, if anybody would like a copy of this presentation, I'd be only too happy to share it with you. Thank you very much for your attention.